Well, a greater share of tax revenue changes to public safety pension funds, the ability to hold public meetings remotely, and those are just some of the asks leaders at the Illinois Municipal League are making of state lawmakers this year.
Illinois Capitol Bureau Chief Max Cotton looks at what cities across the state want and how they feel it will move them forward.
The Illinois Municipal League officially unveiled its 2024 legislative agenda Tuesday. Known as Moving Cities Forward, it has
new and previous items that IML has advocated for in the past, and they continue to be critical issues that we think will help municipalities across the state either with more resources or more authority to address the issues that their residents are seeing.
One major priority is the restoration of local government distributive fund revenues. LGDF dollars are a percentage of state income taxes which go directly to cities and counties. Right now, that number is about 6.5% for individual income tax collections and about 7% for corporate income tax collections. Before 2011, it was 10%, which is where IML wants it restored.
LGDF distribution plays a key role in keeping our property tax burden to our residents low. Without an increase in LGDF, communities across Illinois will need to explore increases to other fees, taxes, and property taxes.
Another IML ask is to allow downstate cities to bring down their police and firefighter annual pension liability payments. Right now, they have to pay 90% of their actuarial liability payments by the end of fiscal year 2040. A bill would extend that payment schedule until the end of fiscal year 2050.
This would provide immediate relief to our communities and our taxpayers who continue to face increasing pension payments.
Another priority is allowing municipalities to hold remote meetings. Right now, they can currently only hold them if there's a disaster declaration by the governor or Illinois Department of Public Health. IML leaders argue this would give cities flexibility and allow members of the public to attend and participate in meetings without physically being there. In Springfield, Max Cotton, WGEM News.